1579. An African man steps off a ship in Japan. He has no name that history records, no rights, no freedom, no status. He was taken from his homeland on the East African coast, transported across oceans, handed between European missionaries like a demonstration piece. He is, by every measure of the world that brought him here, property. 2 years later, that same man is standing in the court of Oda Nobunaga, the most powerful warlord in Japan. A man feared across the entire country, and Nobunaga gives him a Japanese name, a residence, a stipend, a katana, the rank of samurai. His name is Yasuke, and he will fight alongside the most powerful man in Japan. He will stand in burning temples when every instinct says run. He will face an enemy army and refuse to stop fighting, and then he will vanish from the official record. Not because he wasn't real, but because his existence was too inconvenient for the story they needed to tell. A story about African primitiveness, a story about African passivity, a story about Africans as victims of history, never as participants in it. Yasuke destroys that story completely. So let me show you who this man really was, what he actually did, and why they made sure you never learned his name. Let's start with what you were taught. The history of the African slave trade is presented as a one-directional story. Africans taken, Africans transported, Africans enslaved, Africans as victims, as labor, as property, and within that narrative, there is no room for what Yasuke represents. An African man who was taken from his home, who was transported against his will, who entered a foreign world with nothing, and who rose, through his own presence, intelligence, and courage, to become something that no textbook has space for. The official history of Japan mentions him briefly, a curiosity, an anomaly, a footnote buried under more important events. A black servant who amused Nobunaga. That's how most historical accounts frame him. A servant, an amusement, something decorative, not a warrior, not a samurai, not a man who stood in fire and kept fighting, just a curiosity and nothing more. Here's the truth they buried. Yasuke was born somewhere on the East African coast. Most historical evidence points to present-day Mozambique. He may have been Makua. He may have been from another coastal people. We don't know his original name, but we know the world that produced him. And that world matters, because it explains everything that comes after. By the time Yasuke is taken, East Africa is not an isolated backwater. It is a hub. The East African coast, from present-day Somalia down through Mozambique, is part of one of the most sophisticated trade networks in the world. The Indian Ocean trade routes. Swahili merchants are operating across a vast maritime world, trading gold, ivory, copper, cloth, moving between Africa, Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. East African ports are cosmopolitan centers, multiple languages spoken, multiple cultures intersecting, diverse peoples navigating diverse worlds. Yasuke comes from this. He comes from a culture that has been engaging with foreign peoples, foreign languages, and foreign customs for generations. The skills that will allow him to navigate feudal Japan, to learn customs, to read power, to move through a completely foreign world with intelligence and dignity. Those skills are not accidents. They are not luck. They are the product of an East African world sophisticated enough to produce a man who can walk into the court of Oda Nobunaga and hold his own. Think about that when you hear the word primitive applied to Africa, because the man they're calling primitive just walked across the world and impressed the most impressive man in it. In 1579, Yasuke is in the company of Alessandro Valignano, an Italian Jesuit priest, one of the most senior Jesuit missionaries operating in Asia. Valignano is traveling to Japan. He is carrying Yasuke as part of his entourage. The Jesuits used Africans this way, as demonstrations of their global reach. as proof of their power to move across continents and peoples. Yasuke is, in their eyes, a prop, a display piece, something to show the Japanese that these missionaries come from a world vast and diverse beyond imagination. That is all they see when they look at him. They have no idea what they've actually brought to Japan. The ship arrives in 1579. Valeriano and his party begin traveling toward the capital, and something starts happening. Everywhere they go, crowds gather, not to see the European missionaries, to see Yasuke. I want you to slow down here, because this moment, this specific moment, deserves more than a sentence. Imagine it. You are a man taken from your homeland, carried across oceans, used as a demonstration piece by men who don't see you as fully human. You arrive in a country where no one has ever seen anyone who looks like you. Thousands of people pressing to get close. Children on shoulders, elders standing at the edges of crowds, merchants abandoning their stalls, temple monks pausing their prayers, all of them for you. Not for the European missionaries, not for the silk they're carrying or the strange instruments in their bags. For you. The world stops for you. And you have a choice in that moment. You can shrink. You can try to disappear, to minimize yourself, to survive by becoming invisible. Because invisibility for a man in your position feels like safety. Or you can stand. You can walk through those crowds the way a man walks, who knows exactly who he is, not performing confidence, not faking anything, just standing at your full height, meeting eyes, moving with the dignity that no ocean crossing and no European missionary could take from you. Yasuke stands. And those crowds don't see a servant, don't see a prop, don't see what the Jesuits see when they look at him. They see someone extraordinary. The situation becomes dangerous, thousands of people pressing close, children being crushed. A riot nearly breaks out, all because of one man's presence. That presence is what carries him to the most important room in Japan. 1581. Yasuke is brought before Oda Nobunaga. Let me tell you who Nobunaga is, because you need to understand the room Yasuke is walking into. Oda Nobunaga is in the process of unifying Japan after a century of civil war. He has defeated the most powerful clans in the country. He has destroyed Buddhist military orders that had terrorized Japan for generations. He introduced firearms into Japanese warfare and changed the nature of battle forever. He is feared. He is ruthless. He is a military and political genius who answers to no one. Nobunaga has met kings. He has negotiated with emperors. He has broken warlords who thought they couldn't be broken. He does not impress easily. He does not pretend to be impressed when he isn't. He has no reason to impress anyone, no political need to flatter, no social obligation to perform curiosity he doesn't feel. When Yasuke enters his presence, Nobunaga stares. He has never seen a man who looks like this. His first reaction is disbelief. He assumes the dark skin is paint, ink, some kind of dye. He orders his attendants to scrub Yasuke's skin, to remove what he thinks is covering. They scrub, nothing comes off, and something shifts in Nobunaga. Not shock, fascination, deep, genuine fascination. He begins asking questions through interpreters. Where are you from? What is your homeland like? How did you come to be here? Now think about what Yasuke does in this moment. He is standing before the most powerful man in Japan, in a room where Japan's greatest warriors bow so low their foreheads touch the floor, where men who have killed hundreds of people prostrate themselves in Nobunaga's presence. And Yasuke speaks, as a man, directly, clearly, without diminishing himself. He speaks of his homeland, of his journey, of the world he comes from. Not performing deference he doesn't feel, not shrinking to make the room comfortable, just speaking, one man to another. And Nobunaga, who has spent his entire life evaluating fighters, evaluating men, Reading the difference between genuine strength and performed strength, Nobunaga sees it immediately. He keeps Yasuke, not as a servant, not as a curiosity to display, as a companion. He gives Yasuke a residence in the capital, a stipend, direct access to Nobunaga himself, and eventually a katana. If you're already realizing that this story is completely different from what you were taught, subscribe now, because we're just getting started. Let me explain what a katana meant in feudal Japan, because this is the detail that changes everything. In Nobunaga's Japan, carrying a katana wasn't just a practical matter. It was a legal matter, a social matter, a declaration of identity. Only samurai could carry a katana. This was law. The social structure of feudal Japan was rigid in ways that make the European class system look flexible. You were born into your station. You lived in your station. You died in your station. Farmers couldn't carry swords. Merchants couldn't carry swords. Monks couldn't carry swords. The sword was the mark of the warrior class, and not just any sword, the katana specifically. That particular blade, that particular shape. It was the difference between a man who has status and a man who doesn't. Between a man the law protects and a man the law merely tolerates. When Nobunaga gave Yasuke a katana, he wasn't giving him a weapon. He was giving him a legal identity. He was saying, in front of witnesses, in front of his court, with the full authority of his power behind the gesture, this man is samurai, not by birth, not by bloodline, not by the customs that governed everyone else, by Nobunaga's own authority. This was extraordinary. This was unprecedented. There is no other recorded case in Japanese history of a foreigner, a non-Japanese person, being given samurai status by a ruling lord in this way. Not the European missionaries, despite their influence, despite their political value, despite their guns. Not the Chinese scholars who were welcomed and respected. Not anyone, only Yasuke, an African man from Mozambique who arrived in Japan as part of a missionary entourage, the only one. And Nobunaga didn't do this because he felt sorry for Yasuke. Nobunaga didn't feel sorry for anyone. He did it because Yasuke had earned it, because in the time they spent together, Nobunaga saw something in this man that he recognized. The thing you can't fake, can't perform, can't borrow, a warrior's spirit. Let that sink in. The most feared warlord in Japan looked at an African man and saw a samurai. The records we have on Yasuke come from multiple sources: Japanese chronicles, Jesuit missionary letters, court documents. Luis Froa, a Jesuit priest present in Japan during this period, writes about Yasuke extensively in his letters back to Rome. He describes Yasuke's relationship with Nobunaga, the access, the status, the genuine warmth that Nobunaga, a man not known for warmth, shows toward him. Froy writes that Nobunaga was very pleased with him and that Yasuke dined with Nobunaga personally. Stop there, dined with him. In Nobunaga's Japan, personal dining with the Lord was an honor that most samurai never received. It was reserved for close confidants, trusted retainers, people whose loyalty and worth had been proven over years. Yasuke was eating at that table. Japanese court documents confirm his stipend, his residence, his status. This wasn't informal. This wasn't ceremonial. Yasuke exists in the official administrative record of feudal Japan, in documents that were never meant to be found by people looking for evidence of African achievement. Documents written by bureaucrats and scribes who recorded what was real because that was their job. And what was real was Yasuke, a black man from East Africa with a residence, an income, a katana, and a place at the warlord's table. And then there are the battle records, because Yasuke didn't just live in Nobunaga's court. He fought for him. Nobunaga is conducting military campaigns across Japan, unifying the country by force, moving constantly, fighting constantly. and Yasuke is part of those campaigns. Contemporary accounts describe him as Nobunaga's weapon bearer. The weapon bearer walked beside the Lord in battle, in close proximity, within arm's reach, in the most dangerous position on the battlefield. If the enemy reaches Nobunaga, they get through Yasuke first. Think about what Nobunaga is saying when he gives Yasuke that position. He's surrounded by thousands of warriors, the most skilled fighters in Japan, men who have been training since childhood, men whose families have served his family for generations. He could put any of them at his side. He chooses Yasuke, not as ceremony, not as display, in battle, where loyalty and courage aren't philosophy, where they're tested by steel and blood and the specific terror of knowing that if you fail, the most important man in Japan dies. Yasuke is tested in those campaigns, and he doesn't fail. He stands in places where standing means something. He fights in conditions that expose every truth about a man's character, and every time, Nobunaga's trust in him grows. By 1582, Yasuke isn't a curiosity or a symbol. He is a trusted member of Nobunaga's inner circle, a warrior, a companion, a samurai in practice and not just in name. And then June 21st, 1582 arrives. Honnō-ji, a Buddhist temple in Kyoto. Nobunaga is staying there on his way to support a military campaign in the west. He has a small escort, personal attendants, a handful of guards. He doesn't expect trouble. The trouble has been building for months. Akechi Mitsuhide is one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals. He has fought for him for years. He has won battles for him. He has been given land, authority, and trust. And in the early hours of June 21st, 1582, he betrays all of it. He surrounds Honnō-ji with 13,000 soldiers. 13,000. Nobunaga has somewhere between 30 and 100 people inside. There is no escape route, no cavalry coming, no messengers who can reach anyone in time. The most powerful man in Japan is surrounded. 100 against 13,000. Think about what Yasuke knows when the sounds begin. He has been in battles. He has stood at Nobunaga's side through campaigns that tested everyone around him. He knows what an army sounds like when it moves. He knows the difference between guards shifting at night and 13,000 men positioning for an assault. And he knows, before anyone tells him, before any messenger runs in with news, that this is different from anything that came before. This is the end of something. He has choices. He is not Japanese. He is not bound by the codes that govern these men around him. He is African. He is foreign. He could use that foreignness as a shield. He could step back. Let Japanese politics destroy Japanese men. He could walk out of that temple and reasonably expect that Mitsuhide's soldiers, who have orders about Nobunaga's retainers, about clan members, about political threats, might simply not know what to do with him. He could survive this by being what they've always said he was, a curiosity, a prop. Not a real participant, not a real samurai, not really here. He could survive. He doesn't step back. The assault begins. Arrows first, then fire. The temple catches. Smoke fills the corridors. Nobunaga's small guard fights. Against 13,000, it is not a battle. It is a ceremony of loyalty, a demonstration that some men would rather die standing than live kneeling. Nobunaga, wounded, retreats to an inner chamber. He will not be captured. He chooses how this ends, and Yasuke fights. Through Mitsuhide's soldiers pouring into the compound, through smoke so thick you navigate by sound and instinct, through fire that has made the beautiful temple into something terrifying, he fights through it. Not because there is tactical logic in it. The numbers are impossible. This is not a battle that can be won. He fights because Nobunaga saw something in him, because a man gave him a katana and a name and a place at his table and said, "You are samurai," and Yasuke intends to prove that judgment right. even now, especially now. He cuts through to Oda Nobunaga, Nobunaga's son, who is holding a position at a separate location, trying to rally what resistance is left. Yasuke delivers to him what remains of Nobunaga's sword and armor. He is still fighting, still present, still performing his duty after his lord is gone. He stands with Nobunaga as that position too becomes impossible, as the numbers become undeniable, as the last stands collapse one by one, and only when there is genuinely nowhere left to fight, only when the fight is fully over, does Yasuke stop. Mitsuhide's soldiers take him. They bring him before Mitsuhide himself. Mitsuhide looks at this African warrior who fought against his army, who cut through his men, who refused to stop. And he says, "He is a beast, not a human. He knows nothing. Do not kill him." He sends Yasuke to the Jesuit mission house, and Yasuke vanishes from the historical record. Sit with Mitsuhide's words for a moment. He is a beast, not a human. This is a Japanese warlord in the 16th century. This isn't European racial theory. This isn't the language of Atlantic slavery that is being built on the other side of the world. But it is something. It is the language of dehumanization, and notice what it does. Mitsuhide kills everyone else who fought for Nobunaga. He kills Nobunaga. He kills the retainers. He kills the political threats. He kills everyone whose existence complicates his takeover. But Yasuke he sends away, because in Mitsuhide's political calculation, Yasuke doesn't count, can't count. Nobunaga elevated him, made him samurai, gave him status and trust and a place at the table. But to Mitsuhide, standing in the ruins of Honnō-ji, looking at this African man who just fought through his army, he's still a beast, still a curiosity, still not fully human, still not fully real. He can't be a political threat because in Mitsuhide's mind he can't be fully political. So he lives. An African man who fought as well as any samurai in Japan, kept alive because his enemies couldn't see past his skin long enough to recognize the threat he actually represented. Let that sink in. The racism that was used to dismiss him was the same thing that saved his life. Now here's where the story gets deliberately buried, and here's why. Yasuke's story is extraordinary for reasons that threaten multiple narratives simultaneously. He threatens the African narrative, that Africans were passive victims of history, objects, never subjects. He threatens the European narrative, that the global age of exploration was about bringing civilization to primitive people. That if Africans were primitive, explain how one of them earned samurai status in feudal Japan. He threatens the Japanese narrative, that the samurai tradition was exclusively Japanese, pure, untouched by outside influence. 3 different historical traditions, 3 different reasons to minimize him, and the result, 3 different systems conspiring to make one man invisible. In African history, he doesn't appear, because African history in Western textbooks is almost entirely about slavery and colonization. There's no room for an African samurai. The story doesn't fit the framework. In European history, he gets mentioned as a footnote to the Jesuit missions. The missionaries brought an African man to Japan. Period. No further detail. Because a story about an African man rising to samurai status in Japan suggests that Africans could navigate sophisticated foreign systems, earn trust through merit, build relationships across cultures. That contradicts the entire justification for African enslavement being constructed in this same period. In Japanese history, he's mentioned as Nobunaga's Black Page, an unusual pet and amusement, because acknowledging that a foreign African man genuinely became samurai, genuinely earned Nobunaga's trust, genuinely fought at the highest levels of Japanese warrior culture, challenges the idea of samurai identity as exclusively Japanese. 3 directions. 1. Erasure. And a man who fought at the highest levels of one of the world's most sophisticated warrior cultures disappears into a footnote, not because the evidence doesn't exist, because too many people had too much to gain from pretending he didn't matter. Here is what the erasure costs us, not just historical accuracy, though that matters enormously. It costs us the understanding of what African people were doing in 1579. Because Yasuke's story isn't just his story, it's a window into a world that mainstream history refuses to show. An East African man who arrived in Japan, already shaped by a culture that had been engaging with diverse peoples across the Indian Ocean for centuries, who adapted to feudal Japan not despite his African heritage but because of it, because the East African coast that produced him was a cosmopolitan world. Multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple ways of reading power and navigating foreign environments. Yasuke is not remarkable despite being African. He is remarkable in ways that are inseparable from where he came from. And when you erase him from history, you erase that context. You erase the East African world that produced him. You replace it with the story they needed to tell. Africa, isolated, primitive, passive, waiting. Let me give you the timeline they don't teach. 1498. Vasco da Gama rounds the Cape of Africa, reaches India. He does this using African and Arab navigators who already know the route. That detail doesn't make it into the textbooks. 1550s to 1570s, Portuguese establish missions along the East African coast. Africans are taken into Jesuit service across Asia. 1579, Yasuke arrives in Japan. Crowds gather everywhere he goes. A riot nearly breaks out because of one man's presence. 1580, Nobunaga meets Yasuke, gives him a residence, stipend, katana, and status. 1581. Yasuke fights at Honnō-ji, fights for Nobunaga's son after Nobunaga's death, captured by Mitsuhide, sent to the Jesuit mission house. Now, here's what's happening in the rest of the world during these same years, the same year that Yasuke is being given samurai status in Japan. Portuguese and Spanish scholars are developing the legal and theological frameworks for African enslavement in the Americas. The same year, an African man is being recognized as a warrior and companion by Japan's most powerful ruler. And on the other side of the world, European powers are building the system that will enslave millions of people who look exactly like him. Think about what that contrast means. It means African inferiority wasn't observed. It was constructed. It wasn't discovered by Europeans who encountered Africans and concluded they were primitive. When it was invented, deliberately built, to justify an economic system that required African dehumanization, because Yasuke proves that when Europeans weren't running the evaluation, when a non-European ruler was making the judgment from a position of absolute power, an African man could be seen accurately as worthy of the highest status a warrior culture could give. Nobunaga saw what Europeans refused to see: a man, a warrior, an equal. His story is beginning to surface, slowly, incompletely, but it's coming. Historical researchers Thomas Lockley and Geoffrey Girard have done extensive work tracing his origins, piecing together what can be found in Japanese chronicles, Jesuit letters, court documents. The picture that emerges is exactly what the official story tried to prevent. A man who was enslaved, yes. Transported, yes. Used as a prop by European missionaries, yes. But who, when given the chance, when standing before a man powerful enough to see past everything, revealed himself to be someone that a warlord who had never been impressed by anyone chose to elevate. Netflix released an anime series about him in 2021. Fictional, dramatized, but based on a historical reality that most people are encountering for the first time. Because that's where we are. 2021 before most people hear the name Yasuke. a man who stood at the center of one of the most dramatic moments in Japanese history, gone from the curriculum, absent from the textbooks, reduced to a footnote in the records that do mention him, because his existence asks questions no one wants to answer. If Yasuke was samurai, then what else were they wrong about? If an African man earned the highest warrior status in feudal Japan, then what does that say about the lie of African primitiveness? If history has been burying stories like this for 500 years, what else haven't they told you? There is one more thing, the thing I've been holding until now, because it's the thing that hits the hardest when you let it settle. Yasuke's original name. We don't know it. The historical record gives us only Yasuke. The Japanese name Nobunaga gave him, his own name, the name his mother gave him, the name he carried from Mozambique across the oceans, is lost. We know the names of the missionaries who transported him: Alessandro Valignano, Luis Froy. We know Nobunaga's full name and lineage going back generations. We know Mitsuhide's name, his family, his motivations, his betrayal analyzed from every angle. But the African man who stood at the center of all of this? We know him only by what someone else named him, his own name, buried, his own identity reduced to a Japanese word, and still, even with his name lost, even with the records incomplete, even with historians who spent centuries minimizing him, his story survived, because the truth has a way of surviving. Because a man who stood that tall, who carried himself with such dignity through crowds that had never seen anyone who looked like him, through a court full of Japan's most powerful warriors, through the fire of Honnō-ji leaves marks in the world, in chronicles, in letters, in court records, in the historical memory of a nation that watched him fight and couldn't quite erase what they saw. He survives, incomplete, partially told, robbed of his name, but undeniable. In 1579, an African man arrived in Japan with nothing, no status, no rights, no freedom. By 1581, he had a residence, a stipend, a katana, and the trust of the most powerful man in Japan. He walked through crowds that had never seen anyone who looked like him. And he didn't shrink. He stood before the most feared warlord in Japan, and he spoke like a man. He fought in campaigns where failure meant Nobunaga dies, and he didn't fail. He stood in the fire at Honnō-ji when the entire political world of Japan was collapsing, and he kept fighting, not because there was any rational reason to, but because Nobunaga looked at him and saw a samurai, and Yasuke intended to prove that judgment right. Even in the fire, especially in the fire, history tried to erase him, called him a curiosity, a pet, a footnote, gave him half a sentence in the books where he appears. But here's what history couldn't erase: the reason he was there. The reason an African man who arrived in Japan as property left as warrior. Not because Europe gave him something, not because Japan gave him something, because he carried something with him, something that an ocean crossing couldn't take, that missionaries couldn't see, that Mitsuhide couldn't understand even when he was looking directly at it. The thing Nobunaga recognized across a room full of Japan's greatest warriors, a man who knows who he is. That's not something you can enslave. That's not something you can erase. That's not something that stays buried. They couldn't let you know that. But now you do. His name was Yasuke. African, samurai, warrior, and proof that the story they told you about Africa was never the whole truth. This is the history they don't teach, but it's the history that needs to be told. If this changed how you see African history and what they deliberately left out of your education, subscribe to this channel, because every week we're bringing back the names, the stories, and the truths they tried to bury. Drop a comment. What struck you most about Yasuke's story? This is Ancient Africa Untold, and we're making sure the buried names are spoken again.